So what is a raker? If you said this, you're close but not quite. If you said this, you're correct. So let's talk about them. When the transition was made away from older saw blades and older types of saw chain, and we moved to what we'd consider to be modern saw chains, we kept a lot of the names. Even though we kept the same names, a lot of the jobs actually changed and things moved around. So I thought I'd just talk about it today for a bit of interest. So the blade we're looking at is on a bow saw. These are super common and cheap and readily available. The cool thing about them is a lot of them follow the patterns of the original crosscut saws, the 2-man or single-man crosscut saws that we're familiar with. The actual tooth pattern cutting style is very similar. There are two different types of blades available for these bow saws. This one is incorrect for the application I have, but this is a good demonstration of what all those types of saws were. You can still buy these now. These will be described for cutting greenwood. For cutting drywoods or hardwoods, you get this style of blade, but it does not have the raker. It just keeps going with that tooth pattern. So we'll just use this to go through, have a bit of a talk about how it works, how it cuts, and where the names transition to, really. So before we get into what all the parts of the blade or the saw chain actually do, let's know a little bit about our enemy. When we look at wood, for the most part, the major fibre structure runs lengthways in the direction of growth, so up and down the tree. And to give a demonstration of that, I'm just going to use some of these TIG rods, these old TIG filler rods. So what we have is the fibre structure running up the length of the tree. Depending on the wood type, it depends on how hard they're packed together, whether they're twisted and interlocked, whether they grow straight. Hardwoods have a different structure through the centre for moving moisture through a tree. It's complicated, but in the most basic form, this is what we're dealing with. This piece of wood is a whole bunch of fibres all stacked up like that. When we cross cut, we're going across these fibres. The hardest part of cutting is severing these fibres. As a cutter or a cutting tooth moves through, breaking through these fibres is the most power intensive part. Whether you're powering it by hand, using a saw blade, or if your chainsaw's going around and making its cuts. That's why when we cross cut, we go across, we generally pull out smaller little chips depending on what you're cutting. If you're cutting softwoods that aren't all that dense, you'll get longer strips because the fibre actually has a little bit of flexibility in it that way. But for any of the guys cutting hardwoods like me, this is a piece of yellow box. It's a very hard wood. These fibres are very tightly bound together. They're very robust and they're quite brittle. The structures joining the fibres together aren't very flexible. So when you're cutting, this will only produce very small chips. If you go the other way and you're cutting with the grain, a lot of people call it noodling or ripping, however you want to talk about it, and you're making the cuts down through the fibres, coming down like that, things are a lot easier. We're not severing the fibres as such, we're separating them from themselves. So the cutting tooth can come through. So part of the reason that rakers exist, we'll get into this more later, on a saw blade is because of that. The fibres can move side to side. When we come in and cross cut them, they only move so far before they break. When you move trying to cut down through them, like rip cutting, they can bend a lot more. There's a lot more movement there. That's where the cutters have a hard time, and we need something to try and clear all that out. So that's all our wood fibres. What we're doing when we're coming through and we're cutting it, no matter what tool we're using, is we're trying to sever these fibres and clear a curve, our path through the wood. Now, some things to keep in mind. Doesn't matter what we're using to cut through here, we need the cut through the wood, the curve, to be wider than whatever is cutting it. So we don't bind the edge of the saw or the chain and the bar of the chainsaw. So the curve we cut in this must be wider than the cutting equipment we're using. So the way this particular saw blade is broken down is we have two cutter pairs, a left, right, and then a raker. And it continues like that as we go down through the blade. What we get with a saw blade is opposing left and right teeth. So this one is bent or set out to that side, and the next one along leans the other way. And it carries on like that. They are staggered one after the other out to each side. The reason this is done is so that the kerf that it cuts is wider than the blade. If we look at saw chain, the same thing occurs. There is a clearance angle that pushes them out to the side. So when you look at your left and your right cutter, they both bow out. They're not in a straight line. And that is trying to create that extra kerf width so we have clearance down the side and we're not wasting a lot of power just on the friction of moving through the cut. The real difference here is the left and the right hand cutter only score the side of the kerf. Their job is to sever the wood fibres from the left and the right hand side of the kerf. Now in dry wood, that's usually enough. It can break out those chips. But in green wood, it's not. What can happen is it can push those fibres side to side and not sever it in the middle. That's why we have a raker. When you look at a raker on a saw blade, they are swaged down. Generally these will be sharpened to a point, then they're hammered down. The reason that's done is to create like a chisel point on them. So they sit like that. And their job is to run along the bottom of the kerf like a chisel. The fibres on either side have been cut, and then it comes through the middle and cleans it out like a chisel. You might be noticing some differences right here between a saw chain and a saw blade. Even though we have all these common terms, the parts on this are familiar, they don't do the same job on this as they do on here. That's where things become misleading. While we're at it, point out in between each one of these teeth is a gullet area. This is the main gullet area on a saw blade. It'll sit either side of the raker. The reason it sits either side of the raker is because these blades are unidirectional. They're cut on both the push and the pull stroke. So everything is mirrored. The angles of these are important. The depths of these are important. It's a very complex subject, sharpening these things, and I'm not even going to pretend I can explain it in great detail. So let's go over this and have a look at the differences between a saw blade and a saw chain, and we'll look at the common names and how they're slightly misleading. On a saw blade, we have a left and a right cutter, and their job is to sever the fibres of the wood. So they'll clear the side of the kerf. On a saw chain, that is done by the side plate of the cutter. On the blade, we have a raker, and the raker's job is to clear the wood out of the centre of the kerf. The cutters have severed the fibres on the side of the wall. The raker clears the bottom of the kerf. The closest thing we have to a raker on a saw chain is the top plate. It takes over that role. The side plate severs the fibres on the walls of the kerf. Our top plate clears it out. It planes the wood. It forms its chip and feeds it down under here so it can dispose of it. Some other areas. Obviously, between every one of these cutters we have a gullet, and we have a main gullet area here. The main difference between a gullet on a saw blade and a gullet on a chainsaw chain is this one carries chips. This one is just called a gullet. It does not carry chips. The entire design of saw chain is to get the chip out away from the cutter and to be carried out back here on the blank straps. The true gullet area on a saw chain is right there. But you can see where it becomes confusing because we kept the names. This is a gullet, a very well designed gullet for carrying out chips. Then they call this a gullet. Creates problems. So that's some of the basic things between a saw blade and a saw chain. I'm not going to go real in depth into it. The one thing I will say is if more of us use these, we'd probably be better at sharpening these. You can tell a big difference when you get it wrong with something like this because you're powering it yourself. Saw chain's a lot more tolerant to mistakes, partially because it can move on rivets, partially because it's going around a bar, it travels in a different direction, and mostly because it's powered by a two-stroke engine or an electric engine or whatever you are using. With a saw blade, we're powering it ourselves. You can notice small differences. If you're right or wrong with a saw blade, you know it. You generally don't with these. But anyway, I thought that might be of some interest to some people. Should point out that what is commonly called a raker on a saw chain, I understand it's just a common term that's used describing this as a raker. It's not its true function. It performs an entirely different role on a saw chain. I partially find it correct because it is forming part of the back wall of the actual gullet area, and it can help with removing chips from the chain. But the role it performs is very, very different. The name depth gauge is its official term. I don't like that either because it's not really the gauge. I think a depth limiter would be more in line, but I didn't get to name this stuff.